All right. Hello, everybody. This is the first time I'm trying this, going live from YouTube on the YouTube channel Beyond Mental Health with Anup Kumar MD. So if it's coming through okay, please let me know. Hopefully, the audio and video streams are coming through. So just drop me a quick note and let me know. Okay, great. Looks like it's coming through. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Thanks, Robin. That's very helpful. So I just finished a brief talk on the series Misconceptions About Consciousness. Right. So what I'm doing is we'll follow that up with a live meditation as well as Q&A here. So thank you for joining me. Let's take a moment, take a few deep breaths. And since we're going to take a couple questions, we're going to use this time in the beginning to clear out the mind. So if there are thoughts buzzing or doubts, just notice them and allow that sense of space to develop. Notice the positioning of your body, whether it's sitting or laying down, standing. Notice the contact points between the body and whatever surface it's on. And notice where the sense of identity is along the spectrum of ease and tension. Full breath in, holding for a few moments, and exhaling also fully. Notice any movement, whether external or internal. And notice the boundary between the internal and external. All right. Then when you're ready, we'll meet back up here. All right. Looks like it's working. That's step one, the technical success. So the first question I took, first of all, if you have any questions, just put them in here. But I was just on another live stream, and I just want to touch on that first question because it's an important one. The question was why a sense of loss can create the feeling of emptiness and create the feeling of fuzziness. And we're going to be taking a look at all of this through the three minds perspective. All right. For those who are interested in what that is, what the three minds perspective is, let me just put this link here. Hopefully that'll work. If you go there, it gives more detail about what this is, and we can talk about that another time. But for now, just know that the responses that I'll be talking about are in reference to the three minds framework, in which the presumption is that consciousness is fundamental, right? As opposed to the materialist view that the physical world is primary and that anything we might call mental is simply the reconfiguration or the result somehow of something that is primarily physical and not conscious. As opposed to that, we are saying no, it's actually the other way around, that what we call consciousness is fundamental, is primary, and that it experiences itself through as characters and as events and as the world of space, time, and objects. Right? So this is the fundamental premise of the three minds framework. So given that, why is it, let me read this question again, why is it that a sense of loss creates a feeling of emptiness and fuzziness? So what I just said was that just like when you have a room in your home in which you had a piece of furniture, right? Let's say it's a dining table that you've had in your home for decades. And it's such a meaningful dining table because you've had so many conversations over it, so many hearty meals over it, and it's just been a part of your life day after day for decades. And now one day when this dining table is gone from the home, of course, you come down, you're going to feel that sense of loss, right? Even physically, a dining table being this big structure in this room, when that's lost, you almost feel like you can't even walk there because the mind still feels the contours of the table. So it's unusual to have this huge empty space, right? Simply because from a second mind perspective, what we're seeing as the dining table is simply the representation of the mind. And the dining table has a certain significance, right? So it allows us to eat in a particular way. It allows people to come together. It is a standard piece of furniture. It has so much significance that we don't think about. And when that significance is gone, we're going to feel that loss. And that's what we experience as the sense of empty space from the first mind perspective, right? When the movers take the dining table out. So, just like that, in our own minds, when a person leaves, in a sense, from our mind, or when there was a relationship that goes away, then initially that template or that holding space is still there. It's like having a seat reserved, right? So if you go to a concert, maybe the first couple rows may be reserved, and every seat will have the sign reserved, reserved, reserved. But by the end of the concert, maybe a couple seats were never taken, right? Everybody else showed up, but a couple seats were never taken. The seats are empty, but they're still reserved. That's what happens when something leaves the mind, right? The mind is technically empty, but it's still reserved. It's not actually empty because the space has still been reserved for that relationship. And the relationship here is not just with a person, it can be with an object, with an event, with a thing, with anything. And so when that leaves, then that space is felt as emptiness, right? Or as fuzziness. Fuzziness in the sense, think about when that dining table is gone, right? There's kind of this fuzzy feeling, like almost feel like you can't walk there, like you'll bump into it, right? Even though you know intellectually, obviously it's not there. Even when you walk into that space, it'll feel strange. It's like, wow, I can actually stand here. I can actually move in here. I'm not used to being able to do that. That's true for even what we call a physical object. So imagine for something or someone that has emotional value, relational value in the mind, right? Within our own minds, then that same kind of sense can be sensed as fuzziness, as unsureness, uncertainty, and ultimately, as that clears out, that sense will go away. All right, so that is the response for that. If you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. Hopefully, the chat is working. The next question I received was, so these are basically from the website. People went to the website anupkumar.com and submitted questions, or from the previous live feed. So you can submit questions there too. If you don't want to, post them publicly, feel free to submit them through the website as well. So here's another question, which is that when I feel fully conscious, I'm instantly more emotional, and this then tends to make me feel very vulnerable. How can I prevent this? So when I feel conscious, instantly more emotional, and this then makes me feel more vulnerable. How can I present this? So in my own journey, feeling vulnerable has been a key part of it and is a key part of it. Right? So it's all a matter of being able to handle a certain amount of what's happening, like with anything else, right? Too much or too little can become a problem. And so if this is a matter of something coming up when we have to, like when we are at work and we have to do something, and then all of a sudden, if you are going into that more subtle space, right, and all the emotions are starting to come up, then it might not be possible for a person to function, right? So that may be the spirit in which this question is asked. So what I would say is that spend time or make time during the day when you can take this time to be vulnerable and be fully emotional, right? That's a key part of introspective practice. It is undeniable that as a person moves into subtler layers of consciousness, that all the emotions that have been stored over the last decades, over the last lifetimes, can start to come up, right? And so because that is happening, it's important to find the time and place. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that this is what can be helpful, to find time and place where you can actually allow that process to unfold. I told a story a couple podcasts ago about how one time in medical school, I heard a song and started thinking about my grandmother's death and was bawling on the floor for hours, right? Had never bawled like that in my life and haven't like that since. But that was such a key release. It was just a moment where that that layer of the mind was coming undone, was opening up. And I had to take that time, those several hours, to release that. And also because that was released, there were other things that could then happen, right? Other insights, other experiences that could come forth because now that mind was unburdened and available for those experiences. So I understand what you're experiencing, and I know that it can be difficult. The key things are trying to find time when you don't have other responsibilities to allow this to come forth. And also, the other thing is finding someone else, right? This doesn't have to be a lone process. It doesn't have to be just one person, right? All by yourself. It can be a friend or family member you talk to. It can be through journaling. And in these ways, sometimes it's possible to release kind of waves of this as opposed to everything coming out at once, which can be overwhelming and unmanageable, right? Even talking to a counselor, talking to a therapist, these are all different techniques that we can use to navigate this. So I would say rather than avoiding this, it's actually a sign that the mind is opening up and unloading things that it hasn't processed before. And so finding a way to do that in a way that's manageable in your life is the key. All right. So next question was, is the three minds framework unscientific or scientific? All right. So when we talk about science, science is based on this process, right? And it's the process of observing the world. And then based on these observations, we create hypotheses. And then we test these hypotheses, right? We do experiments. And from that, we draw our conclusions or we make observations again, rather, right? When we do experiments, then we make observations of those experiments. And that leads us back in this loop. So we observe, we hypothesize, we experiment, we make our conclusions and observe some more, hypothesize, experiment. And this is how we go in science from an idea to a hypothesis to a theory to a law, right? And this happens because of this repeated process of thinking and correction. Now, the first step in this is observation, right? If I don't observe, then I can't make a hypothesis, right? Just like Isaac Newton observed the moon hanging in the sky and observed that supposedly that the apple fell down and hit his head, right? He certainly observed that when he threw something up, it would come back down for some reason. So, and it's only because of those observations, he then hypothesized that there was some force holding the moon in orbit. There was some force pulling the apple down. And that led to experiments and ultimately the hypothesis of gravity, and then the theory of gravity, and then the law of gravity, right? So it all began with observation. What is observation? Observation is perception, right? So right now you're perceiving a screen and you're perceiving sound and you're perceiving forms moving. And based on this perception, you can make observations and you can say, well, this image in front of me, for example, it's a two-dimensional image. It's not a three-dimensional image like something else in the room. And therefore, I hypothesize, let's just say that this is not actually in the room physically, but it's a virtual image because it's two-dimensional. Now, you create that hypothesis simply because of observation, which is dependent on perception. So we're going through this because when we talk about the three minds framework, the three minds framework is essentially three configurations of identity. And what we say is that identity is the most fundamental aspect of the universe, right? Not any individual's identity per se, but identity itself, which can also appear as an individual identity and then perceiving a multiplicitous world. So, because of this, the perception and therefore leading to the observation and all this being dependent on identity is part of the framework itself. So, science is an overlay on top of this. right? Once a certain identity is fixed, in terms of science, it's mostly the first mind view of science, right? Once the sense of individual identity is fixed, then that individual perceives a multiplicitous world, and then science comes in, and most scientists will then say, well, the world is this or that based on this perception, and then make observations, hypotheses, and experiments, right? So, in this sense, it's not that the three minds framework is scientific or unscientific. It's a way of understanding and experiencing what the world is, and specifically broader ranges of what the world is and what we are than the common stories that we're told. Now, in another sense, we could say that it is scientific because science too is moving towards an observer dependent reality, right? We have realized now that at some point, we can only know the world outside to the extent that we know the lens through which we are seeing. Just like if I look through a microscope, I won't be able to see, for example, my hand well. If I put my hand under a high power microscope and look, I'm not going to see a hand. It'll just be a blur. I won't see the hand at all, right? It doesn't mean the hand's not there. It just means that the lens through which I'm looking is not sufficient, right? So we know that at a gross level, but we're starting to see that at increasingly fine levels, anything that we consider to be objective or external reality may be dependent on the observer, on the lens through which we are looking. So science too is arriving at this place where consciousness and identity are more important than we had previously thought, right? It's not fully on board, obviously, but that is the direction in which science is going. And in my view, will ultimately definitely go there. All right. So next is, so I recently was on the Jeff Mara podcast, and we had been talking about near-death-like experiences. So the question is, what is a relationship between near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, mystical experiences, enlightenment, psychosis, kundalini, so many of these words. And I think this is an interesting question. And I think this is one of the areas that society most needs to study. I think it's critical that we understand this because there's so much going on. It's one of the reasons this channel is called Beyond Mental Health, because there can be a lot of misunderstanding about what we call mental health and mental illness unless we are understanding the many different ranges of mind, how they present, what the transition processes are like within these ranges of mind, and so on. Right? So some things that we call near-death-like experiences. So if it so happens that during this experience that that the physical body was in danger and the physical body was in danger of dying, then those are called near-death-like experiences. Sorry, those are called near-death experiences, NDEs. If it happens to be that there was no threat to the physical body, but there are some other similar features, and there may be a sense of a point of no return, for example, that's a kind of a death, a sense of no return, but the physical body is actually not at threat, and those might be called near-death-like experiences. So the experience I've talked about qualifies as what's called a near-death-like experience because the physical body wasn't actually in any danger, right? Then out-of-body experiences, of course, is simply when the sense of identity goes beyond the body, right? Now, there are many kinds of related experiences. The sense of identity can be out of the body, the sense of identity can be in the body, and the sense of identity can be trans body in the sense that it may not be in relationship with the body at all, right? It's not necessary that identity has to be in relationship with the body. It's not necessary that the body would be the defining characteristic of identity, such that we would have to say in body or out of body. So there are other kinds of experiences too that are not necessarily in relationship with body. So there's near death, near-death-like, there's out-of-body experiences, there's psychosis. So some kinds of psychosis, not all, there are some kinds of what we call psychosis in which the person has a completely different sense of identity, or they're perceiving a different kind of world, right? So depending on why that is happening, that will be different in every case, but depending on why that is happening, that too can be one of these kinds of phenomena, specifically certain types of Kundalini activation, right? Which brings us to another term, Kundalini. So we're probably talking about years worth of essays and explorations that we're trying to condense in a couple minutes, but it's just to hopefully give a flavor for how the same thing or a similar range of experiences are seen differently depending on what one's expertise or preferred outlook or cultural background is. Right? So Kundalini is the creative energy, the life energy that often sits in the sacrum or collects in the sacrum, in the vicinity of the sacrum. And what's often talked about as Kundalini activation is when this energy starts to surge up in the vicinity of the spinal cord. Now, Kundalini is simply creative energy. So often there are conversations about the activation of Kundalini, but actually Kundalini to some extent is already active, right? So artists, people who are creative, doing writing, who are having flashes of inspiration, moments of inspiration, all this is the activity of Kundalini. It's just that it may be active to a certain degree, right? 4%, 3%, maybe even 5%, 6%, something like that. But when it kind of, it's almost like if you have a pitcher of water and it's got a cap on it, and you pouring the water out and it comes out drip, 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 drip. But now suddenly, if you take the cap off and all the water kind of falls out, that's a dramatically different experience, right? So that also can happen. And when that happens, there are different kind of ranges of perception, different dimensions of perception that are well documented, for example, in yoga, right? And in many Eastern traditions, this is kind of standard part of the knowledge. But because of the materialist framework that is often there in kind of the world culture now, in the world educational system, we generally think that that's not possible, or we think it's unscientific, when actually it precedes science in the sense that it deals with identity and perception on which science depends to kind of find out whether something is true or not. So Kundalini is another way to talk about it. Let me see what other words were there. Enlightenment. Enlightenment is another way, because when certain functions are activated, then there's the experience of light, right? So we see light all over, but there's also light within. For example, if you close your eyes and you can imagine a bright sun, right? So where is that light coming from? The easy answer, or the way to avoid the question, is say, well, there's no light, I'm just imagining it. But even if we're imagining it, we're still imagining light. We can imagine light and we can imagine dark. So what causes that contrast, right? So there is an inner light. And from the second mind perspective, there's actually only this light, which is then compartmentalized, and from the first mind perspective feels as though it's within, whether it's within or inside the body. And it is this original light which also kind of reflects as what we call the sun and lightning and the stars and fire and fireflies, as well as the inner light. So as this light becomes apparent, sometimes this is called enlightenment. So these are different words for, I won't say the same thing, but these are different words and different ways of approaching a range of phenomena that are not fundamentally different. And it is critical that we as a society investigate this, right? So if you're a researcher or you are in a position to research this, please do talk to people and start taking this up, because communicating about this widely will change a lot of things. It'll take time. There will be resistance to it, but it will change a lot of things. All right. Kunobi says, thank you. You're welcome. And are empowerments like Shakti activation and Ayurveda transmissions part of Vedanta practice? So Veda is knowledge, and Anta is the end or the culmination. So the culmination of knowledge is what Vedanta refers to. What does that mean? That means that we can go out and study art and music and mathematics and science, and there's no end to the world's knowledge, right? We're always learning more. From the first mind perspective, there's an infinite series of things to know. And I would need infinite lifetimes to learn everything. There's no end, basically. But where does this all lead, right? Just like if you're following a river, and if you try to look at the number of droplets in a river, it's endless. There is no end to the number of droplets because the river is always changing course, and new like bubbles of foam are foaming, and it's always changing. So there's endless. But if you ask the question, where does this all go, right? Where does this all culminate? Well, it culminates in the ocean, right? So there is a culmination where this is all going. Similarly, trying to understand the world by understanding more and more and more things and more topics, it can give a certain kind of knowledge, but ultimately what has to be known is where this knowledge culminates. What is everything pointing to? And that is, after looking at one subject, another subject, another subject, another subject, eventually at some point, once I understand these subjects well enough, if I really start to understand these subjects, what I will see is that actually this knower of the subject, this lens through which I am seeing, is actually what all of these subjects are pointing to, right? Just like the basics of numbers. There's a post on the website. I can't remember the link, but if you go here and if you go to the blog, or if you scroll down, I think there's a link to a post called The Mathematics of Tat Tvam Asi. Tat Tvam Asi is a Sanskrit statement that means that thou art. And we can see that through the lens of mathematics in this blog post, and you can check that out. The point being that even something like mathematics and numbers, which are so fundamental, 0, 1, infinity, 2, even these, when we really look at them in depth, we will see they're reflections of our own nature. And we kind of externalize and project that as numbers in the world. So every subject in its depth, in its root, is a reflection of our own state of mind. And so that is what Vedanta really teaches. And that is, all the practices are simply to understand and recognize this, right? So Shakti activation, transmissions, all of these kinds of things are things that happen as the mind naturally clears, right? There's at least two ways to go about it. One way is to go after them, right? And to even chase them. And what I found is that that can lead to problems, right? Because it's almost like, sometimes it's like giving somebody a vehicle that they can't handle. It's like giving a 16-year-old who just got their driver's license a Formula One race car and saying, go, pick up some bread at the grocery store, right? Probably not a good idea, because the vehicle and its capabilities far exceed the driver's understanding and capability. And so if people start playing with their system, now I do encourage experimentation because I think ultimately one has to experience to know, but there's a responsible way to do it. And chasing after things, whether we call them Shakti activation or different abilities, this can lead to a kind of mismanagement that can create a lot of problems, all right, that can make life very difficult. So in the Vedantic tradition, the idea is that the focus is on clarifying the mind and thereby moving into subtler layers of consciousness, and everything else is a side effect rather than something to be pursued. All right, there are a couple more questions, but why don't we stop it here? It's been a little while. If you have other questions, just submit them in the comments. And otherwise, I will see you, I think, next Tuesday. We'll do it next Tuesday around the same time, maybe around 2:15, 2:20, something like that. All right, you're welcome. You're welcome, Kenobi. So one more thing, if you enjoy this, please do subscribe. I'm trying to work out how the YouTube channel works and see if it's an effective way of communicating. So if you enjoy this, if you think it's helpful, please do let people know, and please do subscribe, and we'll continue this kind of programming.